IVM.
Hey guys, IBM podcast is turning 7. Can you believe it? It's been a pretty awesome journey for us with these wonderful folks, and I can't wait to see what the next 7 years bring.
Welcome to All Things Policy, a daily podcast supported by Pragati, a flagship media initiative of the Takshashila Institution. We're a bunch of policy nerds based in Bengaluru, and we like to bring a fresh perspective to Indian affairs and an Indian perspective to global affairs. So grab a cup of coffee, sit back, and join us for today's chat.
Hello and welcome to another episode of All Things Policy. The Takshashila Institution is an independent, non-partisan think tank and a school of public policy. We have education programs lasting 1 semester and 1 year that are tailored specifically to your needs. They're all online and you can take them from anywhere. Admissions are now open for our 12-week graduate programs in public policy, defense and foreign affairs, technology and policy, and health and life sciences. The program begins on 7th May, and the last day to avail an early bird scholarship is 26 March. Application deadlines are on 30th April. So today, I, Aarthi, and my colleague, Mr. Ganesh Chakravarthi, who is a faculty at the Takshashila Institution, we're going to be talking about the politics of language. So I'd like to bring in Ganesh now.
Hi, thanks for having me. My name is Ganesh. I'm a faculty at the Takshashila Institution and I teach writing and communications for all of the courses. So language has been a very fascinating subject for me since childhood. I have always had a lot of fascination about how different languages shaped up, how different dialects came about, and how a lot of the different people eventually congregated. India also has a very strong political history related to language, the division of states, and all of that. These are aspects that are very fascinating to me. And along with that, I'm also very much fascinated by the building blocks of language, the grammar aspect of it, the syntax aspect of it, the different ideas and the sounds that combined to form what we call words. So I'm really looking forward to this conversation. Thanks a lot, Aarthi, for having me.
Great, thanks, Ganesh. So let's get into it. We're going to be talking about, a little bit of the evolution of language, and then we're going to move towards how language has been used as an instrument in the political discourse. So just to begin with, Ganesh, do you want to give us a little background into the evolution of language?
Sure. So language, it's a very difficult thing to talk about the evolution of language because there isn't one point of origin from which it evolved. You can trace the origin of species to certain aspects, say the Cambrian explosion and some of the other complex forms that emerged out of it. But when it comes to language, it is very difficult. Different regions had different evolutions. Different regions had different origins. So there is no common facet as to where you can trace the origin and the evolution of language per se. But there's this wonderful theory by S.I. Hayakawa about the ladder of abstraction, and that goes a little into the advanced stages of linguistics. The idea being that language, spoken and written language as we know now, evolves from naming very simple concrete objects and then goes on to higher abstract forms which express things that are complex and things that you cannot touch and feel and all of that. That is a very fascinating concept to me. But there's this wonderful piece of literature that I recently read. It's called The Dawn of Language by Sverker Johansson. He's a Swedish researcher and a scientist who researches a lot into linguistics. This is a wonderful book which delves into how language could have come about. And some of the theories that he delves deeply into are very, very fascinating. For instance, what are some of the things that you take for granted when it comes to language but are always there, right? This idea of semantics, this idea of assigning meaning to a very specific set of words. and the independent function of how grammar and meaning exist and coexist. I'd like to quote one of the examples that he uses over here. There's a sentence that he speaks about. The sentence goes, colorless green ideas sleep furiously, right? Colorless green ideas sleep furiously. Now, this is a grammatically perfect sentence, but and it has proper syntax and it has all of the rules that make up the English language, but it doesn't really mean anything, right? Colorless green ideas sleep furiously. So the idea over here is grammar and meaning can be independent of one another. They don't really have to come together. They don't really have to evolve along the same lines. This is one of the theories that he delves into, to the fact that linguistic evolution, language evolution, may not necessarily have happened because of syntax and structure, but it happened because of assigning more meaning to one another. Another cool aspect of language that I really find very interesting is the temporality of language itself. Another example that I'd like to quote, and this is something I use in my teaching as well. If I were to use this sentence, the surge of Omicron preceded Zelensky's stand against a Russian invasion. If I had used this sentence in the year 2018, it would have meant absolutely nothing. But today there is a very specific meaning to it. The structure and the choice of words that you use to define the structure and the different combination of words that you construct a sentence with also has a very timely aspect attached to it. So these are some of the interesting things that I came about. Again, evolution is a big thing. And I think there is, like I said, there's no one area, one origin point from which language evolved. It evolved with different dialects, it evolved with different occurrences, events, as and when they became plateaus or markers, language constantly evolved.
So, if that's the case, do you think it would make more sense to consider language as a tool or as an instrument that can be manipulated for various purposes? Because even in the example that you said, right, regarding Zelensky and what's currently happening in Russia and Ukraine. So let's say, ordinary words, they start off as a common property, something that can be freely used, defined, or related to, right? But when it becomes politically sensitive, the meanings become so privatized. So they're manipulated for the situation, right? So do you think instead of saying that language is something of a natural evolutionary growth, we can consider it as a tool?
Absolutely, we can. So, a lot of research also points this way in the sense that the biological similarities between human beings and apes are still very, very similar, right? There are a lot of similarities between us. But the ability to use language as a means of communication essentially marks it as a tool itself. And if you look at some of the properties of what language actually does, I mean, I use a set of words, and you, as a listener, will listen to this set of words. There are certain connections that happen in your brain, there are certain inferences that you make out of it, and then you get some meaning out of it as well. So there is a lot of things are happening over there, right? It's not just exchange of information that is happening, and a lot of things happen. This is what sort of makes it as an instrument or a tool which is currently out of bounds in the level of complexity that humans have for other animals. So definitely it is one of the tools that we have used. And in a way, Swakar Johansson also makes the case that because it is a tool, it may not have been a sort of biological evolution itself, and it is something that could have happened as habituated stuff and other things. So we as humans currently and have something, so we develop as we grow, as we communicate, as we are talking with other people, listening to other people, we develop something like a language module within us, right? So this module automatically allows you to generate sentences. And what is a sentence? A sentence is a collection of words. What is a word? A word is a collection of alphabets. What is an alphabet? An alphabet is essentially a symbol, right? So there are these different, the deeper you go down, you're essentially conflating a set of symbols, attaching meaning to it, combining a whole lot of symbols and making a word, and then using that to communicate with others. This is especially true for written communication specifically. And even in spoken communication, you do similar stuff. You're manipulating air, and that is actually just a set of sounds that you're manipulating with the use of your tongue. And then the language module in the listener's mind automatically translates it and gleans certain meanings out of it. So it's a very fascinating tool. And I think it has been used quite a lot. When I say it has been used, of course, we talk every day and it is in use, but it has also been used to achieve very specific outcomes, not just related to communication, but to a whole lot of other things as well.
Yeah, that makes sense, So, I mean, like you simplify it so well, I mean, at the end of the day, language is just broken down into, words and alphabets. So do you think over time we have just grown to overcomplicate things? Like it would be so much easier to communicate a sentence that would easily be understood. But do you think because we're after creating, an effect that we choose to overcomplify simple things, just so that it has that effect on people. And we'll talk about this a little more in the international realm and as a political discourse. But even in everyday language, do you think, just even as like speakers, do you think like you just choose to use bigger words or words that sound more sophisticated just to convey that sense of intelligence or power?
Absolutely. And let's look at it this way, right? Humans, as using communication, especially with words, right? Whenever they have to use language as a means of communication, I always lapse back to this one very good example that I've read in a piece of fiction. I love reading science fiction, and one of my favorite books is by Cixin Liu about the Remembrance of the Earth's Past trilogy. In that, there is an alien civilization that communicates only via thought, right? It communicates only via thought. One individual thinks something, and that is automatically transmitted to the other individual with absolutely no loss in translation. Now, think of it this way. Uh, we have different languages, and different languages have different scripts. Many languages are written in from left to right. Urdu is written from right to left. Both of these are technically linear forms, right? Writing from right to left, writing from left to right are basically linear forms. But thought happens in a nonlinear fashion. So you are actually thinking something, you are narrowing it down with a set of words which is expressed in a linear way, and then you are expressing it. The other individual is looking at it in a linear way, and then they are making inferences in a non-linear fashion, right? It's a very fascinating and very, very interesting process when you look at it. And this loss in translation also allows a lot of people to use it in different ways. You can choose to obfuscate, you can choose to conceal, you can choose to lie, you can choose to frame things in a way that may be far too sophisticated for one set of people to understand, but maybe easier for another set of people to understand. Very similar, very diverse set of ideas are available when it comes to that. And animals can use misdirection, especially in hunting and other stuff. But we humans, by means of language, can use misdirection through the form of words themselves. So definitely, yes, there is an aspect of it where people can utilize it in different ways than how it was originally intended.
Right. That makes a lot of sense. So we're just going to take a quick break. And when we come back, we're going to apply whatever we discussed into the political realm.
Hey everybody, it's been another great week on the IVM Podcast Network. On Cyrus Says His Cock and Bull, Cyrus, Kajol, Ayushi and Antrish discuss the grave subject of Putin threatening to take nuclear action and Indian students being stuck in Ukraine. On The Habit Coach, Ashton is joined by Neha Sahai, celebrity nutritionist and wellness consultant. They take a deep dive into various issues people face when it comes to nutrition. On the Filter Coffee podcast, Karthik speaks to Vishal Menon, assistant editor at Film Companion. They trace the evolution of Malayalam cinema. On Big Talk About Tiny Humans, Devi Shobha and Meghna share pro tips to help your child beat exam stress. And on Hansvani, here's the story of Lafantus. It hilariously tells us about the colorful characters we encounter in all areas of life. So, on a personal note, I wanted to let you all know that this week marks the 7th anniversary since I started IVM. I'm eternally grateful to the team we have here, especially Kavita Rajwade and Tejas Sringarpure, who have been here since the beginning. They've seen the struggles, our eventual acquisition by Pratilipi, and our continued struggles to make podcasting a large and thriving part of the media industry. We have the best hosts in the world, and I have to say that I'm so glad and so grateful that they have chosen to work with us. And finally, I'd like to say thank you to you, the millions of folks who have heard or watched our content. All I can say is, you ain't seen nothing yet. I hope you join us as we continue this journey. In the meanwhile, do follow us on social media. We're IVM Podcasts on Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, and LinkedIn. And remember, if you're enjoying this show or any of our other shows for that matter, please do tell a friend. Also, don't forget to rate us on any platform you're listening to. You can also check us out on YouTube. To get a list of all of our channels, you can go to ivmpodcast.com/YouTube, where you can go to all the channels. And finally, we'd like to thank our sponsors this week, SBI Life Insurance, Bank of Baroda, Max Life Insurance, India Water Portal, and HDFC Life Insurance. Thank you so much for making this possible.
Welcome back. So, as we discussed before the break, we spoke about a little bit of the evolution of language and how the context in which language is used. So, right now, let's delve into some the more specifics of language and how it's used today.
Before that, Aarthi, I also wanted to ask, because you're a poet yourself and you have written an entire book on poetry itself. And poetry, by the way, is a very complex form of expression, because poetry generally has layers and layers of meaning attached to it. Every word can be conflated to mean an entirely different thing depending on the mood of the reader themselves. Could you talk a little bit about your experience with words and your fascination with this sort of medium and all of that? I'd love to get your thoughts as well.
I think I would not consider poetry as complex because I mean, like we discussed, it's just a bunch of words that are put together. And I think people tend to look into its meaning too much because you call something as a poem, right? But I think the difference between poetry and, a normal prose would just be, I think that it gives you more freedom to express your thoughts and it can't be questioned because it is a personal opinion, right? As compared to any other form of writing, people will contest that. There will be disagreements. But with poetry, nobody is going to do that because they accept it as your own thoughts and your own emotions. And this is why, so I was inspired with poetry because I was, reading a lot about in my master's, I was of course reading a lot about war and especially all of the genocides that have taken place in the past. And one thing that really caught my attention was during the Rwandan genocide, children used to, put their emotions on paper with just simple words. And even now, right, even with the Russia-Ukraine conflict, the I think more than political leaders speaking, if you look at poetry or if you look at the just a bunch of sentences that children put together, it's just so meaningful and there are no lies behind it. It's just the true essence of what they're feeling. So for me, I think poetry is the truest form of expression and there's no complexity to it. I think it's just the simple fact that the other person respects your opinion when it's in the form of poetry.
That's fantastic. Okay. Yeah. It's interesting what you mentioned about genocides, because even though those were very ghastly occurrences in history, some of the pieces of literature have served to actually make people understand the level of impact that they actually caused, right? And that is something that is quite fascinating, even from a public policy perspective, because a lot of times language is used as a means to obfuscate certain political objectives. There's this wonderful video about Stephen Fry talking about how the Nazis used certain words to cover up some of the outcomes of the actions that they were perpetrating on the Jews, right? So there are many such aspects about political messaging itself, which can be used to specifically hide and conceal a lot of stuff. Could you talk a little bit about that, Aarthi? Because I know that if your inspirations were acts of tragedy that happened in the past, can you also share some other examples where political messaging was used in a way and language was manipulated?
I think if you look at any political context, it's so easy to see how words are being manipulated. There's just this sense of pretentiousness where you try to use the most, you try to dress up words in such a way that it it hits people right where it should. So when you're talking about, when you use words like, let's say, objective or basis or eliminate in the context of war or politics, it it makes your subjective opinion sound factually correct. And even in
Right,
the context of war, right? When you use like adjectives like epic or historic or inevitable, it sort of glorifies war. And this can be used, phrased in such a different manner, but because you want to convey the intensity of the situation, because you want to convince people that what you believe in is actually true, you sort of dress it up with words.
right. One example that I'm seeing these days is about how the conflict that's currently happening in Europe is being termed as the Ukrainian crisis as opposed to Russian invasion, because
Yeah.
both of them would have very different meanings in the geopolitical context. So that is a very good example of what you just said. And also, I think something that I also talk about in terms of active voice and passive voice usage, these are deftly used in political messaging a lot. This is one thing that I've observed. If you look at some of the phrases where if you use active voice, it automatically assumes that you are directly talking from your own personal experience. But by using passive voice, if you look at political apologies, people will never say, I am sorry for what I have done. They will always say, I apologize if offense was caused. So if you say
Mhm.
offense was caused, it automatically shifts the blame of
Yeah.
that offense in part to the listener as opposed to the perpetrator themselves. And I think this is also an interesting aspect of how language is used in an obfuscatory fashion. And not just that, I also think that there are very specific connotations attached to it. There's this wonderful Noam Chomsky, obviously, is a very famous person, talks a lot about how language evolved and how these things are used in very different ways. Right?
Yeah.
One of the famous things that he talks about is this idea of communism itself. Are you familiar with that? Would you like to talk about that?
Yeah. I mean, of course, I'm not to get into the details of it would be, I think it would just make more sense if you could talk a little bit more a bit. But that is a very good example to get into.
Yeah. So, in simple terms, he talks about this idea of how communism is basically a society where community is actively involved in its very literal sense. Communism, in its very literal sense, is a thing where community is actively involved, but as a political system, it has an entirely different connotation because of what has happened all around the world. Right? There is empirical evidence that looks at a very top-down structure where the people generally don't have a lot of say in what they have to do. And that is a very good example of how language can mean different things to different set of people. And whether you are pro something or opposite something, right? Whether you're pro something or anti something, the meaning of it can be manipulated in different ways. And this is one thing that I always think about, because it is one word. In the end, it is one word, but it can be used in many different ways to mean very different things to a whole lot of people.
Yeah, this also reminds me of George Orwell. He had written an essay which is called The Politics and the English Language. And he
Yes.
heavily criticizes how, language is just used to manipulate people's thoughts. And he says corrupted language smothers independent and original thinking. So, and the truth is, there is no keeping out of politics. In this day and age, anything you say becomes like a political statement. So, but he says that, language has evolved in such a way, and writers and journalists just tend to use language to their advantage, by forcing a certain thought process onto people. So he says the essence of language and its true purpose is just being lost over time, especially in the context of crisis, because you fail to show what really matters, but rather you focus on what you want the other person to see as how you see it. So, for instance, one thing he says is the phrase collateral damage. And this has
Hmm.
become such an okay term to use in the context of war, because it says that, innocent civilians are just unfortunate victims of violence. But just this phrase, collateral damage, it makes it seem that it's a justifiable price to pay for the greater good. And we spoke about how language is used as a tool, as an instrument. And I think this is where, it matters. When you use phrases like this, it fails to take into account of the reality and the harshness of the situation by just stringing together a phrase that sounds like it does, take into consideration what's actually happening, but in reality, it doesn't.
Right. And automatically it shifts the blame. Rather than shifting the blame, it points out the loss of life as a very inevitable, unavoidable occurrence. And I think that is also a very good example to use.
Yeah, and I think, one way we can maybe start doing things differently is that to counter corrupt language, the best thing to do would be to use honest language. It's literally language against language. And honest language as a political act in itself can be used as a form of resistance, against, we talk about misinformation and, just a widespread manipulation of rhetorical structure. So, but to counter this, we can actually use honest language, honest communication. What do you think about that?
Yeah, I think that is a very good thing to have. And I liked what you said about it being an act of being a revolutionary act in and of itself, right? Because when most of the world is inundated with obfuscating language, speaking directly can be one of the things that sets you apart and gives you a lot more authenticity and gives you sort of a better standing in public discourse. And I think it will serve well if it has to involve a lot of people and be very, very clear. And I always advise a lot of people to use active voice, because speaking in active voice naturally forces you to speak in terms of very clear and direct messaging. If you look at some of the greatest speeches in history, in India as well as abroad, everywhere, the greatest speeches have mostly been spoken with such passion and such energy and conveying a very personal touch to it. And those are mostly always in active voice, because it conveys an authentic version of what they want to say. It is my hope that someday in the future, this sort of thing becomes a norm, wherein we don't have to have specific decoders or additional meanings attached to political messaging. Let's hope for the best.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, we can just conclude by saying that in a time where there's so much of division and so much of conflict, and obviously there are plenty of languages in the world, right? But I think just breaking down language and words into their simplest form should be able to bring us all together, irrespective of the language you speak, the language I speak. But just using simple words in a time of crisis, I think would make all the difference.
Absolutely. Thank you. Let's hope it becomes true. I certainly hope so. Thanks for having me, Aarthi. This was a lot of fun.
Thank you so much for being here. And thank you all for listening.
If you liked our show, don't forget to check out other interesting podcasts on the IVM network. You can tune into them on the IVM Podcast app, ivmpodcast.com, or wherever you listen to your podcasts. You can also follow IVM on social media. The handle is @IVM Podcasts on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram. And hey, if you'd like to dive into Takshashila's research on technology, strategy, and economic affairs, check us out at our Twitter handle @TakshashilaINST or our website takshashila.org.in.
Love fighting?
We've got you covered.
Check out our show, The Fighting Goat, where we, the voices of the internet, Arjun Chipalkatti and Somesh Kamra, bring to you crazy weekly action on your favorite combat show, The Fighting Goat.
Be it commentary, breakdown, predictions, analysis of styles and techniques.
And of course, your round of favorite fighters.
You can listen to us every Thursday on the IVM Podcast app, website, and all major podcast streaming platforms.
Are you looking for finance products and services that can enhance your personal finance experience? Are you looking for a space to talk about your financial product or service? And are you looking for a crisp talk show where the conversation is all about money? Well, your search ends here. Hi, my name is Anupam Gupta and I'm host of the Paisa Vaisa podcast, and I invite you for the conversation about your personal finance on each Monday on the IVM Podcast app or the website or on any podcast streaming platforms. See you folks.